For 11 years, my husband told me I was lucky anyone had married me. He said it the way other people say good morning casually, often with a little smile, until I believed it all the way down to the floor of myself. I was lucky to have him. I'd be nothing without him. No one else would ever have put up with me. He said it so many times, in so many small ways, that it stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like a simple fact about the world. The way the sky is up and water is wet, and I was lucky he'd settled for me. This is the story of the heist I ran on that lie. Because every one of those words was designed to do one job, to make absolutely certain I would never leave. And it worked. For 11 years. Right up until the day I discovered the one thing strong enough to finally break the spell. And once it broke, I did not fall apart. I got organized. I planned my exit the way you would plan to quietly empty a vault in 5 careful moves, while the man who'd spent over a decade telling me I was worthless stood and watched me walk out the door with everything. Let me break down exactly how it was done. But before I do, I want to ask you something. And I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Has someone ever said something to you so many times that you started to believe it's something small and cruel? Repeated until it felt like the truth about who you are? What was the sentence? Be honest, because naming it is the first crack in it. For me, it was 6 words: you're lucky anyone married you. Tell me yours in the comments. I read every single one. And to anyone watching who is living inside a sentence like that right now, please stay with me to the end of this one. I promise it goes somewhere better than where it starts. I also want to say, gently and clearly, before we go any further, what I'm describing in this story has a name. And the name is emotional abuse. For a long time I wouldn't use that word, because Brett never raised a hand to me, and I'd absorbed the idea that abuse had to leave a bruise to count. It doesn't. A person who systematically erodes your sense of your own worth to keep you compliant is doing real harm. Even when every individual sentence sounds small enough to laugh off, if any of this is landing a little too close to home, please consider talking to someone you trust, or a professional who works with this. Because an outside voice is often the first thing that can break the spell from the inside. You are allowed to take your own experience seriously, even if no one ever left a mark you could point to. First, you have to understand the vault, which is to say, you have to understand how a capable woman ends up believing she's worthless. It did not happen all at once. That's the thing about this kind of slow erosion. If he'd said you're worthless on our first date, I'd have left. Instead, it arrived in increments so small that each one was easy to excuse. A joke at a dinner party at my expense, and when I flinched, I'm kidding, why are you so sensitive? A compliment with a hook in it, you actually look nice tonight, for once. A steady, patient rewriting of history in which every good thing in our life was his doing and every problem was my fault. Over 11 years, drop by drop, Brett wore a groove in me, until the woman who'd once been confident and capable genuinely could not remember being her. I had a career when we met. I had friends, opinions, a whole self. I used to be funny at parties. I used to have a strong opinion about almost everything, and no fear of saying it. I used to walk into rooms instead of edging into them. I want to name all of that. The specific texture of the person I'd been. Because part of what these relationships steal is the memory that you were ever anyone else. Brett didn't just make me feel small in the present. He slowly convinced me I had always been small. That the confident woman in my own memories was a fiction. That this diminished version was the real me finally being honest about herself. Reclaiming my worth wasn't only about the future. It was about reaching back and rescuing the woman I'd actually been, and refusing to let him keep writing her out of my own history. By year 11, I had a husband who reminded me daily how lucky I was to have him, and not much else because he had carefully, gradually arranged it that way. I want to slow down here, because if you've never lived inside this, it can be hard to understand how a smart, capable person doesn't just walk out the first time someone is cruel to her. So let me explain it the way I finally understood it. The cruelty never came alone. It came braided together with affection, with apology, with good days. So that you could never quite be sure which version of him was the real one, and you spent all your energy trying to get back to the good one, blaming yourself for the bad. He'd tear me down on Monday and be tender on Wednesday, and by Friday I'd have decided the Monday version was my fault for provoking him. That's the machinery. It isn't constant cruelty. Constant cruelty is easy to leave. It's intermittent cruelty, wrapped in just enough warmth to keep you reaching, that rewires a person. By year 11, I wasn't staying because I was weak. I was staying because 11 years of that braid had quietly convinced me that the bad days were the price of the good ones, and that I was lucky to get any good ones at all. And here is the part I understand now that I could not see then. None of it was random cruelty. It was infrastructure. A woman who believes she is worthless does not leave. She does not ask hard questions. She does not check the accounts or wonder where her husband really is on a Thursday night. The relentless tearing down wasn't Brett being a bad-tempered man. It was Brett building a cage, one belittling sentence at a time, and the bars of that cage were made of my own diminished sense of what I deserved. The most insidious thing about a cage made of words is that it travels with you. A cage of iron you can at least see. You know where the bars are, and some part of you keeps testing them. But when the cage is built inside your own head, when you have been taught to be your own jailer, there's nothing to push against, because the thing keeping you in place is your own belief about what you deserve. Brett didn't have to lock any doors. He'd installed the lock in me. I'd turned down opportunities before anyone could reject me, because I'd already decided I wasn't good enough. I'd shrink in rooms where I used to shine. I policed myself far more harshly than he ever could have, because I'd absorbed his voice so completely that I'd mistaken it for my own. That's the real horror of this kind of control, and the reason leaving it is less like breaking out of a prison and more like waking up from a spell. You don't escape the cage. You realize, slowly, that it was never locked, and that the voice telling you it was never really yours. So what was the one thing strong enough to break the spell? It was discovering that the man who told me no one else would ever want me had, for the better part of 2 years, been wanted very enthusiastically by someone else. Her name was Heather. And the day I found out about Heather was the day the whole architecture of the lie finally cracked. Because the central pillar of everything Brett had told me about myself was that I was unlovable, undesirable, lucky to be tolerated. And here was proof, undeniable proof, that the man who'd built my whole prison out of that idea didn't even believe it himself. He'd been so busy convincing me that no one would ever want me that he'd forgotten to hide the fact that he was off being wanted on the side. The lie collapsed under its own contradiction. I remember the exact physical sensation of that collapse, because it was not what I expected. I had always assumed that discovering an affair would feel like shattering like the worst day of my life. And in some ways, it was devastating. But underneath the devastation, almost immediately, was something I had not felt in years. Something that frightened me with how good it felt. Relief. Because for 11 years I had carried a low, constant hum of self, blamed the sense that I was the problem, that I was lucky, that I needed to be grateful and small. And in the space of one discovery, that entire framework just fell over. If the man who'd told me no one would ever want me was being wanted by someone else, then the whole story was a lie, and if that part was a lie, maybe all of it was. The affair didn't just break my marriage. It broke the spell. It handed me, in the cruelest possible package, the one thing I'd needed for 11 years. Proof that the voice in my head had been lying to me. And you cannot unknow that. Once you know it. If you have ever felt a cruel belief about yourself suddenly crack that vertigo of realizing the cage might not be real, do me one quick favor before I tell you about the 5 moves. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm, strategic revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage, and your one tap is the only reason the next one reaches a woman who is, tonight, sitting inside a sentence someone taught her to believe. And believe me, what I did in the weeks after the spell broke is the part you came for. Because here is what 11 years of being told I was nothing had accidentally done. It had made everyone, including Brett, completely underestimate me. And underestimation, it turns out, is the single best cover a person can have for a heist. Nobody guards the vault they think is empty. Move 1. I stopped believing the story. This was the first move and the hardest, and everything else depended on it. Before I could take a single practical step, I had to do something that took more courage than any legal maneuver. I had to consider, just for a moment, that the sentence might not be true. That maybe I was not lucky anyone married me. That maybe Brett had told me that 10,000 times. Precisely because the opposite was true and he needed me not to know it. The moment I let myself entertain that possibility, really entertain it, 11 years of fog started, very slowly, to lift. The discovery of Heather wasn't just evidence of an affair. It was evidence that I'd been lied to about myself, and if that lie wasn't true, then maybe none of them were. That single crack of doubt was the crowbar that opened everything. I want to talk directly to anyone watching who is still inside the spell, because this move, stop believing the story, is the one that doesn't cost money or require a lawyer, and it's available to you tonight. You don't have to be sure the cruel thing is false. You just have to be willing to wonder. That's all it takes to start. For years, I had treated you're lucky anyone married you as settled fact, something to be endured, never examined. The first genuinely powerful thing I did was simply ask, is that actually true? Not to argue with him, to ask myself, quietly, honestly, and the moment a sentence you've treated as a law of nature gets downgraded to a claim that might be false, it loses almost all of its power over you. Because now it has to earn its place instead of just owning you by default. Doubt the cruelest thing you believe about yourself. Just doubt it. You don't have to win the argument today. You just have to reopen it. Move 2. I took quiet inventory of what was actually mine. Once I stopped believing I was worthless, I started, for the first time in years, actually looking at our life with clear eyes, and what I found astonished me. Because the story Brett told, the one where he was the provider and I was the lucky charity case, did not match the records at all. When I looked honestly at the 11 years, I saw a woman who had given up a real career to run his entire life, who had managed the home and the finances and the social calendar and the 1,000 invisible things that let him succeed, who had brought her own assets and her own earning history into the marriage. I had not been carried. I had been the foundation, told daily that I was the burden. The inventory of my own life, taken with clear eyes, was the exact opposite of the story I'd been living inside. Move 3. I secured my own ground. Quietly, this is where the heist became literal. Calmly, without a single change in my behavior that Brett could notice, I began to put my own footing in order. I made sure I had access to and a clear record of our finances. I opened an account in my own name and began, carefully and within my rights, to protect my own resources. I gathered the documents that mattered, the records of what I'd brought in, what I'd contributed, what was legally mine. I did it slowly, a piece at a time, never enough at once to be noticed. A statement here, a copy there, I learned where everything was and how everything worked, things I'd let Brett handle for years, precisely because handling them had become another way for him to feel large and keep me dependent. Relearning my own financial life was its own quiet act of rebellion. Every account I came to understand was a bar removed from the cage. Knowledge, I discovered, is the opposite of the helplessness he'd cultivated in me. You cannot keep someone small once she knows exactly where she stands. And crucially, I did all of it while continuing to play the part Brett expected. The small, grateful, diminished wife. Because his belief that I was too beaten down to act was the very thing keeping the vault unguarded. Every day he underestimated me was another day I could work in the open without being seen. There is a strange dark gift hidden in having been underestimated for years, and I want to name it because it's the engine of this entire move. When someone has decided you are small, harmless, incapable, they stop watching you. Brett had spent over a decade so thoroughly convinced of my helplessness that the idea of me organizing anything, let alone an exit, simply did not occur to him. He left statements lying around. He spoke freely on the phone. He never once imagined the diminished, grateful wife was paying close attention. Because in his mind, I didn't have the capacity. And so the very contempt he'd built to control me became the blind spot I walked through. I did not have to be sneaky. I just had to be exactly who he already believed I was: quiet, compliant, beneath notice, while underneath, I did the most consequential work of my life. The most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone has agreed to ignore. Move 4. I documented the truth, all of it. The affair with Heather, traced and dated, calmly and through entirely lawful means. The financial reality of who had actually built our life. I made a simple list, 2 columns, of what each of us had genuinely contributed over 11 years, not the story. The facts. And looking at that list was its own kind of therapy, because the facts were so wildly out of step with the narrative I'd been fed. There was no version of the truth in which I was the lucky charity case. There was only a version in which a capable woman had been systematically convinced to undervalue an enormous contribution by the one person who benefited most from her believing it was worth nothing. And in a private way that was just for me at first, the pattern of the 11 years, the slow erosion. The contradiction at the heart of it. I wasn't building a case to scream at him. I was building a case to walk away clean, and to make sure that when I did, the version of events that prevailed was the true one, not the one he'd spent a decade installing in my head. Move 5. I went to a lawyer, and I learned exactly how wrong the story had been. This was the move where the private truth I'd reconstructed met an outside expert who confirmed it, and I cannot overstate how important that confirmation was. When you've been told something about yourself for 11 years, your own counter-evidence always feels suspect. Like you might be flattering yourself, like maybe he was right after all. I walked into that office still half-braced to be told that I was, in fact, lucky he'd married me. Instead, I got the opposite, from someone with no reason to comfort me, and every reason to be coldly accurate. She looked at everything I'd assembled, and she told me 3 things that I will carry for the rest of my life. The first, you did not get lucky that anyone married you. Looking at these records, he got lucky. You've been the financial and practical backbone of this marriage for 11 years. In a divorce, all of that contribution counts, and it counts heavily in your favor. The second, that the affair, documented, and the financial truth, documented, put me in a far stronger position than I had ever been allowed to imagine. The man who'd told me I'd get nothing without him was, in legal reality, looking at a divorce in which I was entitled to a great deal because the law, unlike Brett, actually counts what a person contributes. And the third thing she said, quietly, was the one that broke something open in me. She said, "I see this all the time. The ones who get torn down the most are almost always the ones who were worth the most. He didn't belittle you in spite of your value. He belittled you because of it. It was the only way to keep someone like you from realizing she could leave. I had to ask her to say it again, because the first time it didn't fit through the door 11 years had built in my mind. He belittled me because of my value, not in spite of it. Sit with how completely that inverts everything. For over a decade, I had experienced his cruelty as a response to my failings, as if, somewhere, there was a better version of me that wouldn't have provoked it. My lawyer, who had watched dozens of these marriages dissolve, was telling me the cruelty had never been about my failings at all. It had been a strategy, calibrated precisely to the size of what he stood to lose if I ever woke up. The more valuable the woman, the harder these men work to convince her she's worthless. Because they are not managing a burden, they are guarding a treasure they're terrified will discover its own price. Every cruel sentence Brett ever said to me was, "I finally understood." A backhanded confession of exactly how much he knew I was worth. He didn't belittle me in spite of my value. He belittled me because of it. That was the sentence that finally, completely, replaced the other one. So, I finished the heist. With everything in place, the secured finances, the documented truth, the legal picture, and most importantly, the restored knowledge of my own worth, I filed. And I want to tell you about the day I left, because it is the image the whole title is built on. Brett, even then, did not believe I would actually do it. He stood there as I prepared to go, and he reached one more time for the sentence that had always worked. "You're lucky anyone married you. You'll be back. You're nothing without me." And for the first time in 11 years, the sentence simply bounced off. Because I knew by then that it had never been a fact about me. It had been a tool, used by a frightened man to keep a valuable woman from realizing she could go. I looked at him, and I didn't argue, and I didn't cry, and I didn't explain. I just left calmly, completely, and with everything, my fair share of what we'd built. The resources I'd protected, the documentation that made the divorce clean and strong, and the one thing he'd worked 11 years to steal and never quite could, because it had been mine all along, my sense of my own worth. I want to describe the actual moment of walking out, because it was so much quieter than I'd imagined, and that quiet was the whole victory. In all my years of fantasizing about leaving, and I had fantasized, in the small, hidden hours, more than I ever admitted, I'd pictured a screaming match, a grand speech, me finally saying every devastating thing I'd swallowed for a decade. But when the moment actually came, I didn't want any of that, and the not wanting was how I knew I was already free. A speech would have meant I still needed him to understand, still needed his agreement, still needed something from him. I didn't. I had stopped needing his version of me to change, because I had changed my own. So I just picked up my bag and walked to the door, and the silence in that room was the sound of a spell that had finally completely lost its power. You don't need a grand exit when you've already left on the inside. The door was just a formality. The divorce was strong, because the truth was strong. The contribution I'd made over 11 years was counted, exactly as my lawyer said it would be. The affair did Brett no favors. He walked away with far less than the man who'd promised I'd get nothing had ever imagined. And I walked away with far more, not just materially, though that mattered, but in the way that counts most. I left with myself. And here is what no settlement could have given me. The thing I'm proudest of. I got my laugh back. I got my opinions back. Within a year I was working again. In rooms where I spoke first instead of last, among friends who'd quietly wondered for years where I'd gone. The woman Brett spent 11 years insisting didn't exist turned out to have been there the whole time, just waiting under the rubble for someone to stop standing on her. That someone, in the end, was me. Heather, I heard, found the real Brett somewhat less impressive than the version who'd been performing for her. Because a man whose entire identity depends on having someone smaller to stand on is not much of a man once she stands up. I think about that often now, the way these men are, in the end, so much smaller than the people they shrink. Brett's whole sense of himself had been built on the contrast with me. He needed me diminished not because he was strong, but because he wasn't. He could only feel tall standing on someone he'd convinced to crouch. And the moment I stood to my full height, the illusion of his size collapsed, because it had never been his height at all. It had been my crouch. That is the secret at the center of almost every relationship like this one, and I wish someone had told it to me 11 years earlier. The person tearing you down is not doing it from a position of strength. They are doing it from a position of terror that if you ever stood up straight, you would see exactly how small they actually are, and you would go. They are not bigger than you. They have just talked you into kneeling. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not just as someone who got revenge, but as a woman who was talked out of her own worth for 11 years and talked herself back into it, it's this. When someone repeats a cruel sentence about you often enough that you start to believe it, ask yourself one question. Who benefits if I believe this? Because a person who truly loves you does not need you to feel small. The ones who work to shrink you are almost always the ones who are frightened of how large you actually are. The cruelty is not a description of your worth. It is a confession of their fear of it. If you are living inside someone's sentence right now, I want you to hear me clearly. It is a tool, not a truth. And the day you set it down is the day you find out everything you were told you couldn't do. The people who truly love you will spend their lives reminding you what you're worth. Only the ones who need you trapped will spend theirs convincing you that you're worth nothing. Learn the difference by what a person's words do to you over time. Love builds you up so you can stand on your own, even if that someday means standing somewhere far from them. Control tears you down so you can only ever lean on the one tearing you down. One wants you free. The other wants you dependent. And the cruelest trick of all is that control often arrives disguised as love. I'm only saying this because I care about you, so watch the effect. Not the packaging. If a person's love consistently makes you smaller, it is not love. It is a leash with a kind voice. There's one more thing, though. About a year after I left Rebuilt, working again, more myself than I'd been in over a decade, I got a message from Heather. Not the message you'd expect. She wanted to warn me about something she'd discovered about Brett. Something from before he and I ever married. That explained where the whole cruel playbook had come from in the first place. What she told me, and what I understood at last about the man who'd spent 11 years shrinking me, is a story entirely its own. And it might just be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You are going to want to see how that one ends.